Hello everyone and welcome to chapter 17. We're going to be looking at ecosystems and communities. Now, what do we remember from our last chapter? Remember from last chapter that ecology is actually the study looking at organisms and their relationship with the environment. And so as an ecologist, you can study at an individual level, you can study at a population level, you can actually study at a community level, and you can study at an ecosystems level. Now, ecosystems are going to include the living and non-living components. And so this week, we're going to be looking at ecosystems, looking at the living and non-living components. So 17.1, in summary, we're looking at 17.1. We're going to be looking at the basic idea of an ecosystem. We're looking at the community. What are communities? Communities are different population of species within a certain area. They're all living there at the same time. And what we're going to do now is include the non-living components. So the sunlight, the water, all those are going to be a part of the ecosystems, right? So community consists of all of the populations of different species, as was mentioned before. So community, part of a specific area, they all working together because there are different populations within there, whether it be humans live there, whether it be in a tropical forest area. And as we said before, when looking at a ecosystem, we have to take into account the living and the non-living. Now, what name do we give to the living versus the non-living? If you remember the term biology, bio is life, and of course, ology is the study of life. So biotic there would mean living. So within that ecosystem, if you have living matter, it's going to be biotic, and abiotic would be non-living matter, such again as the sunlight, the amount of rainfall, the temperature of the environment, all those would be abiotic. Okay, the river, that would be abiotic. The soil, all right, abiotic. So all those would be abiotic versus biotic when we're looking at the living organisms within that area. So as an ecologist, as was mentioned before, you can study ecology at an individual level, at a population level, at a community level, and at an ecosystems level. And so for this particular lecture, we're looking at the ecosystems level. Now, when looking at ecosystems, there are different types of ecosystems that we can look at. One of the two major categories of ecosystems. And so here we see an aquatic ecosystem. But don't forget that we just finished talking about biotic versus abiotic, and here you can see there's some examples there. And even on my next slide, because it's a very easy chapter, it also gives you some even more examples of biotic versus abiotic. So the food that's there, the pathogens that there would be biotic. Abiotic would be like the atmosphere, the sunlight, the temperature, all those factors would be a part of course, abiotic. So, ecosystems, the physical, the community, the biotic, the abiotic, all are going to be a part of an ecosystem. So, what are some the chemical components that you might see within an ecosystem? The amount of nitrogen, the amount of carbon, the amount of phosphorus. What about the amount of water? What about the soil, as mentioned before? What about temperature? All those conditions are going to contribute to an ecosystem. So when we review this information, we look at this information, we're looking at some of the different physical, right, abiotic uh, environment or environmental influences, whether it be temperature, phosphorus, chemicals, soil, water, all those. Okay. All right. So I mentioned some of those already. So we need to go over them. So 16.1 again is really breaking down for you the living versus the non-living matter. And what we're going to be doing now is looking at biomes. And biomes can be thought of as really huge geographic areas, whether you have land or water. These areas can stretch quite far, they're quite diverse, they have a very specific weather pattern. So that's, you need to take that into account when looking at biomes. Again, biomes can be terrestrial, biomes can be aquatic. That means, of course, they involve water. So they can be terrestrial and they can be aquatic. Okay? There are some questions that you want to be able to ask yourself when evaluating a biome. You want to ask yourself, what is the average temperature of this biome? What is the amount of rainfall or precipitation within that biome? What is the temperature constant, right? Is there constant rainfall? So these are some of the questions you want to ask yourself when looking at biomes. And so there are a number of biomes. There's going to be tropical forest, there's desert, there's savanna, there's temperate grasslands, there's coniferous forest where conifers are found. We talked about conifers before in the past, so hopefully you can make that connection. There's tundra, okay? There's chaparral. There's different biomes where there's a specific temperature, there's a specific precipitation, and these biomes now we can kind of go over in summary. So we're going to start with some of these terrestrial biomes. Tropical forests. You have seasonal rainfall, you have heavy monsoons, you have dry periods, you have coniferous forests where conifers are. Remember that conifers are going to have an antifreeze, so they're going to be found in areas, these trees are going to be found in areas where it is quite cold, right? So they have very short summers, they have very long winters. You have tundra, where there's a little precipitation, and you can see that I'm highlighting that. And in this particular area, you have the lowest average yearly precipitation would be in a tundra. What about savanna? Savanna, as you can see there, will have the highest average annual temperature, okay, within a savanna. And then you have temperate grasslands. Grasslands, if you think of grasslands, think about, like a cow or organisms that will be eating the grass, and you need to think about organisms that would eat that cow or eat whatever is eating the grass. So that's why you would see coyotes there, okay, would be in that area. You would see lions in that area in temperate grasslands because there are a lot of grazing mammals there and grazing organisms there. And so as a result of that, you're going to have other predators that will feed on those grazing mammals. And of course, you have deserts. Okay, so deserts are going to be cold versus hot, and so you can actually have deserts, whether it be very, very warm or, of course, very, very cold. The idea when looking at deserts is to take into account there is hardly any precipitation or hardly any rainfall in those areas. That's why it can be cold or hot. So we move on now to aquatic biomes. So lake and ponds, estuaries, open oceans, rivers and streams, and of course coral reefs. So they're a little bit different when looking at aquatic biomes because physically they're going to have water. There's going to be water. So the depth of the water, so that's why lakes and ponds are being mentioned, rivers and streams, they're going to be flowing very differently than maybe, for example, the open ocean. So lakes and ponds, all right, non-flowing fresh water. You see rivers and streams there. One of the things I want you to take note of is estuaries. This is an area where you have salt water and fresh water mixing. And so that would be, of course, important. That would be critical. You have a lot of organisms growing in that area. The biodiversity is quite high within estuaries because that nice little mixing of salt water and fresh water, it creates a nice area for biodiversity. You have different organisms that were feeding off different things there. And so you have biodiversity increasing within estuaries, okay, where you have a mixture of salt water and, of course, fresh water. You have open oceans, you have coral reefs areas. I'm not going to spend too much time on those. You're going to be, as it says there, deep sea water area. So there's not really much to know about open oceans. Just be aware that there is a difference, obviously, between terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes. So what are some of the differences that you might observe when looking at biomes? Well, we take into account, again, the precipitation, the amount of rainfall, obviously that's there, and you want to take into account the temperature that's there, okay? And those two are going to affect the vegetation, going to affect the organisms that will survive and live in that area. And so when you're looking at each biome, these vast areas, you want to take into account and review, hey, what am I really paying attention to here? What's important? What's critical? Well, the temperature is going to be important, okay, within that biome. The precipitation, the how much the rain fall in this particular area. Those are the questions that you have to basically ask yourself. Now, when looking at biodiversity and looking at how these organisms survive, you will notice that the sun doesn't supply its energy evenly around the world. There are just certain specific areas where you'll see there's a higher intensity of, the sun rays. And so the solar energy will be more focused right there by the equator. And so organisms will be different there. The biodiversity will be different there compared to other areas on Earth, okay, other latitudes. And so we'll talk about that in the future when looking at the temperature and rainfall patterns. They're going to have a specific sequence because of how the Earth is and the type of energy that the sun is actually supplying to the Earth. And so you'll see that when we talk about in the future, the curvature of the Earth, how does it affect these biomes and how does it affect the temperature and rainfall, all right? And we'll talk about that in the future. What about rain? Okay, what about rain? So there are kind of a global patterns of rainfall and they can be predicted, right? There are certain areas that are warmer than other areas. Moistures will be moving from one specific area to the next. The equator, as you know, will get a certain supply of solar energy. And so all of this, how the air will be heated by this energy will be one factor. We know that hot air rises, right? And so that will affect the movement of all the different rain clouds, right, around the world. What about cooler air? It will hold a lot more moisture, a lot more molecules. Okay, so clouds will be rising. So these are just different factors that will even affect biomes depending on where in the world they are found, right? Because in order for rain to be formed, you have different solar energy, right, heating up the ground, which therefore affects the air rising. From the air rises, it's going to cool, of course, become clouds and fall back as rain. What about areas where you see low or little precipitation? Okay, so as you can see, you'll have rainfall. Cool air will be found in a specific area on the globe. And so not any questions will want me to ask about this. I won't be going through and asking questions, what area will you have desert formation? We're not really necessarily talking about that. What I want you to realize that there are a number of factors that will affect how biomes work, the temperature of biomes, right? And that's the main idea. And when you're going through this lecture one, in this short little section, understand the differences between the biomes and some of the key factors about each biome. And that's one of the things that you want to make sure that you understand. So lecture one is pretty quick, pretty easy. What we're saying by looking at these different factors is temperature, the amount of precipitation affects biomes. And therefore we see the temperature and precipitation being at different latitudes as we go around the Earth, because the solar energy that is hitting the Earth will be different, okay, based upon where the Earth is hitting. So if it's at the equator, you'll have a different solar energy versus the poles. Okay? And that, of course, will affect the condition of the biomes, which affect organisms that live in those biomes. Right? So that's the main idea of the 17.3. Okay, so that is the end of lecture 1, part 1. I'll be doing lecture 1, part 2 to continue to 17.4.